Hello and good evening all. Tonight we are here to take a look at Jaguar's return to prototype racing after more than 2 decades away from the sport. And, perhaps more surprisingly, that return came not from Coventry or anywhere in the UK, but from Virginia, courtesy of a racing team owner who'd spent the better part of the 1970s campaigning triumphs. The XJR-5 represented both an audacious pitch to a company hemorrhaging money and the foundation for what would eventually become Jaguar's late 80s dominance of sports car racing, though you'd be forgiven for not knowing it, given how thoroughly the later Tom Walkinshaw racing cars overshadowed their American progenitor in the historical record. Still, somebody's got to set things straight, and since we try to do things properly here, especially when it comes to the underappreciated bits of racing history, it may as well be yours truly. Incidentally, we will be releasing, I say we like there's other people involved in this, it's just me, but we/I will be releasing short guides on each Jag prototype in the lead up to the omnibus narrative video going over the whole history of the line, but since that's being split into 2 parts for length considerations, there are 3 more car-specific guides to come before the first part of the big video detailing XJR-6, 7, and 8. Let's get started with XJR-5. By 1981, Jaguar was in rather dire straits. Having been absorbed into British Leyland in 1966 and subsequently subjected to all the management excellence for which that particular conglomerate was known, the marque had seen its US sales crater through the 1970s. We're talking losses of something like £1 million per week as the decade turned, which is rather a lot of money to be setting fire to on a weekly basis. The recent separation from British Leyland under new chairman John Egan meant that the company was at least no longer answering to politicians and union bosses simultaneously, but they still needed to do something to arrest the decline in their most important, or at least most lucrative, market. Enter Bob Tullius, who ran a racing operation called Group 44 out of Virginia and had recently wrapped up a program with Triumph. Tullius had previous experience with Jag V12s, having raced E-types and XJSs with some success, and he also gets a brief extra digital cookie or flower in the lapel as co-driver of the channel favorite Helmet TX turbine car back in the 1960s. His pitch to Jag was pretty straightforward. IMSA's new GTP category presented an opportunity to return the marque to Le Mans for the first time since 1957, but a successful racing program could reverse the company's sales decline. The marketing team determined that an incremental sales volume of just 200 more cars per year would cover the expenses, which works out to less than 200 per month, so not exactly an overwhelming challenge if the program generated any meaningful publicity. The design work for the new car fell to Lee Dykstra, who had previously been with General Motors and Ford and had most recently designed the twice IMSA champion Chevrolet Decon Monzas. Dykstra spent most of '81 in the wind tunnel developing what would become the XJR-5, and the fundamental concept was really rather clever. He leveraged Jag's 60-degree V12 configuration to create the widest possible venturi tunnels underneath the car. Venturi tunnels, for those unfamiliar, apply Bernoulli's principle to create downforce by accelerating airflow through progressively narrowed underbody channels, generating pressure differentials that essentially vacuum the car onto the track. Though there had been previous ground effect cars in Can-Am and Formula One in previous decades, thanks to Chaparral and Lotus respectively, rules lawyering meant that by the early 80s, endurance racing had become the primary home for this small bit of aerodynamic wizardry. The Jag's chassis was an aluminum honeycomb monocoque, not particularly revolutionary, but continuing established aluminum fabrication traditions that Jag had employed since the D-Type days. The engine, unlike the D-Type, was the aforementioned 6-liter naturally aspirated V12, initially equipped with 6 Weber carburetors and producing approximately 600 horsepower. This sent power to the rear wheels through a Hewland 5-speed manual transmission that also provided mounting for the rear suspension components, a setup that Lee Dykstra had employed before, and one that saved both on weight and complexity. The carburetors would eventually be swapped for Lucas Mikos fuel injection when Le Mans entered the picture. Stopping power came from Lockheed ventilated disc brakes with cast iron rotors and 4 piston calipers. Initial weight came in at about 930 kilograms, which is, I can't do that math in my head, 220, 300 pounds, something like that, though iterative development would eventually reduce this to around 850 kgs. The aerodynamic development, as mentioned, exploited the narrow V12 configuration to enable deeper and wider venturi tunnels than other more conventional power plants could accommodate, which allowed the Jag to generate considerably more ground effect downforce than contemporaneous competitors. Construction took the better part of a year, with a debut at Sebring in '82 set as the goal, but as with so many things, delays meant the car wasn't ready until June, which is when Sebring isn't, because it's too damn hot in south-central Florida by that time of year. Initial testing over the summer impressed observers from Coventry, while the car's competition debut came at Road America in August. The team took third overall and victory in class, though the rest of the year was marred by continuous minor issues that prevented additional podiums. Undeterred, Tullius hand-waved 82 away as a development year, and the car lost some weight through thinner body panels alongside other modifications in preparation for the 83 Daytona 24 Hours, which at that time was being marketed as the 24-Hour Pepsi Challenge. Sounds more like something you'd have a bunch of middle high schoolers come up with because they aren't old enough to drink yet. The improvements did come good in '83, not at Daytona, admittedly, where wheel bearings and suspension failures intervened, but at Road Atlanta, when Tullius and Bill Adam topped both the class and the outright podium. Reliability nevertheless remained a thorn through the year, but 3 more victories followed at Lime Rock Park, Mosport, and Pocono Raceway. By 1984, the engine was producing north of 650 horsepower, with carbon fiber and Kevlar bodywork replacing the fiberglass and aluminum, though only 1 victory materialized that year. 2 cars ran at Le Mans in '84, marking Jag's return to La Sarthe for the first time in more than a quarter century. Despite the cars being capable of more than 210 miles an hour, with drivers including Brian Redman and John Watson, Holmes naturally couldn't be bothered, they did struggle against the more purpose-built Group C entries. The bright point for the team came early that year. The XJR-5s had much larger fuel tanks than their Group C competitors and lasted about 15 minutes longer between pit stops. So, Tullius briefly led Le Mans overall around the 45-minute mark when all the Group C cars came in for their first stops. Naturally, they didn't hold on to it long and dropped back to 10th, and both cars eventually retired, one with a broken oil tank and the other with an overheated gearbox. Thus, to keep the program rolling, 1985 had to deliver. Daytona saw fire after a tire pressure loss, but Road Atlanta provided some salvation with a 1-2 finish. More importantly, at least for Coventry, back on the dealer forecourts, the GTP program was quite successful. US sales were up significantly, breaking records, and Jag was apparently delighted with the program's progress, largely due to the sales records, because the on-track performance was a little bit better than middling. Anyway, everything looked promising for the next stage, which would be the XJR-6 from Tom Walkinshaw Racing over in Britain, but before we get there, there is still the matter of Le Mans 1985 to discuss. Harsher fuel limits had been imposed after a year of delays, aimed at slowing down the all-conquering Porsche prototypes, but unsurprisingly this had an equally or even more deleterious impact on the big cats. The white and green XJRs were very much the outsiders, as they were the sole entrants in the IMSA GTP category against a sea of Group Cs. The works Porsches, admittedly with special qualifying engines, blitzed the lap record, setting an average speed record that lasted for more than 3 decades until the fall of the LMP1 era. The 2 Jags, however, were not quite so fast and were actually more than 20 seconds in arrears. Matters got worse. Poor quality fuel caused the team to lose both engines during Wednesday night's practice sessions, and with only 2 spares remaining, they had to adjust the engine timing to prevent issues with fuel detonation. At this point, hopes for a race win were, well, a pipe dream, and even a classification and finish might have been pushing Group 44's luck. In the race, a wheel out of balance in the first hour meant that even the rather faint honor of taking the lead when the Group C cars came in earlier for their first pit stops was not to be. Despite the team's best efforts, the second car of Redman, Haywood, and Jim Adams stopped on the run to Dunlop with a busted CV joint in the wee small hours of the morning. Though Redman, who was driving at the time, was able to repair it trackside, the car's location had forced him to leave the car's lights on for safety, and the time spent in repair meant that there was no longer enough battery power to restart the V12. Thus, there was but one. The 44 car was still running, mid-pack through the night, but in a show of solidarity with its road-going brethren, Solidarity Reg, the Jag developed electrical issues on Sunday morning, costing 40 minutes in the pits to correct a misfire. Even with that dose of traditional Britishness, an hour and a half on the clock saw the team eyeing a top 10 finish with dubious hope in their eyes. Then, a valve dropped into the piston and went straight through the cylinder head. Unbelievably, the team did manage to actually fuddle the cars efficiently to complete a final couple of laps running on only 11 cylinders to take 13th overall and victory in its class of 1. It was Jag's first Le Mans finish since 1963 and their first class victory since probably 57 or whenever, which, frankly, I do think deserved more celebration than it received given the circumstances. Group 44 would continue campaigning XJR-5s through 1985, but by then Coventry's attention was turning with greater interest towards the XJR-6 and Tom Walkinshaw racing. The XJR-5 had nonetheless accomplished its mission, proving that Jaguar could return to endurance racing, that American sales would respond positively to a racing program, and that the fundamental concept of a big, naturally aspirated V12 in a ground effect chassis could be competitive. Not bad for a car designed in Virginia by a small team working without the unlimited resources of a factory effort. The cars survive today in various collections and occasionally, which is to say increasingly infrequently, unfortunately, appear in historic racing events. Jag Heritage maintains at least one example. Bob Tullius reportedly still owns one of the latter chassis. There's a XJR-7, which we'll talk about in a little bit, so I won't go into details about where that one is. Anyway, for a car that's very often forgotten in favor of its more successful TWR successors, the XJR-5 deserves its recognition as the car that brought Jag back from the wilderness and laid the groundwork for everything that followed. In the opinion of this colonial, I think it's not too shabby for a bunch of colonials, all things considered. On NPR. Okay, that's a wrap for this week's video. Next week, we will be taking a look at the XJR-6. Shameless plugs for this video include the Howmet TX and Chevy Decon Monza, and of course, Group C as a class/historical period of racing has been covered in Speed Efficiently, the Group C story. After I get through this series of videos and perhaps do ones on Porsche, Lancia, and Mercedes and their Group C efforts, there might be a much more expanded Group C video in the offering. We'll see. For this week's call to action, not featuring the 3 sacred words of YouTube:
like, comment, subscribe.
Never trust a Russian when a 5-year plan is on the line. For context on that, I was reading some historical stuff about the Molotov-von Ribbentrop Pact after I got into an argument with a Soviet Union-born immigration attorney. It's a strange sentence that I never thought I'd be uttering, but yeah. Anyway, with that, I have but to say, as always, thank you for your time this evening, or whenever and wherever you are watching, and I wish you all good night and a good tomorrow.